Ocean that happens at Ahmedabad University is about. Uh, this is not the first time we are doing this. As a matter of fact, many of you who have been part and parcel of our entire seminar series, the webinar series that we've had throughout the last academic year, do know that this is actually the second iteration of a very successful, well-watched, well-discussed webinar series that we have right now. We have participants coming in from across the globe. I do know that, yes, we should have worked on our timings a bit better. But once again, I am happy that we have all these lovely faces with us. Just a quick idea of what we are trying to do over here. Since I've already mentioned that this is the second iteration, the Indian Ocean and beyond Gujarat is to bring in scholars who are deeply thinking of the ocean, not merely as a representative space, but to eventually end up thinking of the ocean as method itself. So this has been one of our ongoing challenges, our ongoing shared research interest. And we are very happy that the Center for Inter-Asian Research, which is headed by Professor Tejaswini Niranjana, and the Center for Indian Studies in Africa, which is by the University of Witwatersrand, and Professor Dilip Menon is leading this particular center. So we have come in collaboration, these two centers have come into collaboration, and we have our current Indian Ocean webinar series that you are all privileged to. So I would like to start off by just quickly mentioning both Professor Tejaswini Niranjana and Professor Dilip Menon. They have been the backbone, if you want to call it, of this entire webinar series. We are very thankful to them. We are also happy that they have sort of kept this second iteration and they've asked us to focus on more and more new knowledge, new approaches, new ways of thinking of the ocean itself. I do know that you are more interested in listening to our great speaker for today, and I'll hand over to my colleague and friend, Professor Murari Jha, and he will introduce our speaker for the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Savan. I think it's a great honor and privilege for all of us to host today Professor Lakshmi Subramanian for today's talk. She's joining us from Goa, where she works as visiting professor of history at BITS Pilani. And Professor Subramanian has been very productive, and she's written so many research articles and books. I'll briefly mention three recent books that she published. So first was Indigenous Capital and Imperial Expansion, Bombay, Surat, and the West Coast, where she actually very convincingly established the Anglo-Banya order and how capital from indigenous sources and alliance and collaboration between indigenous and imperial forces led to imperial expansion in the late 18th century. Amongst her recent book is Singing Gandhi's India, Music and Sonic Nationalism, which focusing on yet another repertoire of Gandhi to mobilize people through songs and gathering sea covers and kind of very interesting for understanding another facet of nationalist mobilization and movement. But I think her, I find her book, The Sovereign and the Pirate, is extremely interesting because I think it's perhaps the first systematic attempt to actually delve deeper into the question of piracy on India's west coast. And of course, her focus on a littoral society is kind of, this term was brought to focus by Alan Pearson some time ago, but Subramanian's study actually brought in more empirical depth to understanding the amphibious character of so-called pirate mariners and different forces, local chiefs, colonial administration, and power play went. And that's kind of, perhaps today's talk is going to center around that, and her grasp over the archival sources and historical ethnography is something actually a treat for a historian, the way she interweaves ethnographic study with archival materials. And so without further ado, I would like Professor Subramanian to take the dice.
Okay. Good evening. Thank you very, very much, Murari, for that very gracious introduction. And thanks to the center and this initiative, which I've really enjoyed, not so much as a participant, but as an observer and somebody who listens to these lectures. Thank you very much. I think you're doing great service to oceanic studies at large. Now, for those of you who may have read the book, The Sovereign and the Pirate, 2016, now this presentation may sound a bit repetitive, maybe even tedious. So I'm therefore going to try and do something different. I'm going to try and introduce an element, hopefully, of freshness into the talk by rehearsing now the rationale that initially led me to do this work, and bring it into conversation with more recent, just 2-3 years ago, recent scholarship on the politics of predation, on piracy, and particularly on the web of very ambiguous sovereignty that all kinds of water spaces and littorals, not just in the Indian Ocean, but in the larger space of maritime Asia, and I'm thinking of the South China Seas, were subject to for part of the early modern and the modern period. So I'm hoping that we can continue to have this conversation, which is really very much beyond Gujarat, but I'm also trying to make an argument for comparative histories of this kind of phenomena between Southeast Asia and perhaps China. Now, when I began work on this in 2015, actually, I was primarily interested in engaging with the discourse and the discursive aspect of piracy. I mean, there was generally a feeling that this whole idea of piracy was constructed by colonial and imperial representations, which made a distinction between Asian predation, seen as a kind of regressive activity, and European privateering, which was somehow engaged in debates on politics and legality. So this distinction between Asian piracy and European privateering was, of course, based on the assumption that Asian rulers had no interest at all in controlling the sea, while European power was integrally connected with maritime domination. So Britannia rules the waves kind of idea gave Europeans an almost enchanted right to control and dominate the sea. So I was interested in interrogating this discourse. And when I was doing that, I was drawn to the idea of exploring the political rationale of coastal states in India, how they envisaged their understanding of territorial waters, if not the high seas, because Indian piracy is mostly littoral piracy. But I was trying to do this largely from an official European archive and tangentially from a corpus of vernacular material generated by states mostly Maratha states like the Kudal of Savantwadi and the Angriyas of Kolaba. So that was the initial thrust of my interest, to really peel out the layers of discourse. Now, at this stage, when I began work, I was also very persuaded by the work of Lauren Benton and her argument for legal pluralism. Of course, she was making the argument in the context of empire and a variety of spaces, but the ocean figured quite centrally in her argument, the argument being that this ocean is unbounded, it was hard to control, and as a consequence, you had pirates and other agents jockeying for space and engaging in what she called legal posturing. So there was a kind of attempt to think about legalities differently, which made the ocean a kind of complex space to understand. Now, of course, she demonstrated this mostly with reference to European pirates. She was looking at Avery, Kidd, all the famous, infamous European pirates, and then extended the argument by default to think about this very complex dynamic between the hinterland territorial states and the oceanic regimes. And she argued that it was anyway a porous space and which made for some kind of a quasi-legal interface. So I was very interested in this argument, and I did engage with the argument in a bit in my early iterations of the work. But on a closer examination of archival material that I chose to work with, and about which I will talk about, a very different perspective emerged for me. One that did not necessarily sort of typecast piracy as part of legal jockeying or pluralism or legal posturing, but as a process that was actually embedded within a very dynamic political economy of what I call small state building, grey markets, and use of maritime violence by small states whose social origins were also anchored in very complex negotiations between landed communities, warrior lineages, and seafaring groups. So when I actually went into the archive trying to read along the grain, I realized that not law as much as custom, not just simplistic understanding of violence, but a very fraught negotiation between warrior lineage groups that settled down and entered into relations with coastal seafaring groups that were cemented by a range of unusual social and religious sanction and practices. So that was something that certainly made me realize that I had to animate piracy with very complex meanings, and I therefore needed a different lens to look at it, not just law, but to look at mobility, to look at dispossession, to look at social alliances, to look at active resistance even, that really opted for violence at sea or violence in the waters as a kind of strategy. So that was the kind of perspective that I wanted to apply in my own treatment of piracy in this period. Now, I'll come back to it in some detail, but let me also, before we get into the slides, let me also say the kind of material that I chose to work with, or I was sort of persuaded to work with. Now, this involved two registers of material, archival material. One was straightforward political negotiations of the European companies, primarily the English East India Company, with a series of coastal states. And this was very difficult to capture because the political proceedings are literally fragmented. I don't mean it metaphorically. So you had to go and look at stuff from Cambay, you had to look at stuff from Junagadh, you had to look at stuff from Navanagar, Porbandar, Bombay, some of which are centralized, some of which not. And you had to try and read these political negotiations quite carefully because a variety of actors were involved. So it was not just a straightforward case of a European company actor negotiating with a state, but actually negotiating with multiple actors. They are non-state actors, they're also state actors. And each of these actors have very different ways of communicating their priorities. So I would look at merchant petitions, I would look at ethnography undertaken by the Bombay Marine, the naval arm of the English East India Company. I would have some scraps of material by chieftains. And so it was initially, I had to map what I had, and then I had to read very carefully along the grain to be able to make sense of the patterns that emerged from this kind of archival work. So that was the first register of archival documentation. The second one was the judicial proceedings that comes much later in the period, the early 19th century, between 1808 and 1814, which I worked with. It's much more to be done. And these were judicial proceedings of pirates who were caught, tried, and punished. And you find a huge corpus of judicial proceedings which are scattered again in Bombay and in Calcutta, because very often the trials moved, because the pirate is a mobile subject and you can't expect a particular trial to take place only in one space. So this really made the archive a moving one and a very difficult one to pursue, and fragmented but not unyielding. So I do want to make the point, I hope to demonstrate this as I present my material and my argument, which is really a statement about the political economy of littoral power and about the nature of politics in these states, particularly among subaltern sections of coastal society, and also very largely to do with the nature of the archive that I actually handled. I do want to make a point that I end in the 1820s, my book ends in the 1820s, but having looked at the material and having seen actors move from Kathiawar to Kutch to Sindh to Makran and to the Trucial coast, and having seen different kinds of proceedings right till the 1840s and 50s, I really think that this story remains to be retold. I mean, I have done it till the 20s, but I do hope that somebody takes it up and carries the story forward. And I have a feeling that new insights will actually come. So can I have the next slide, please? So let me sort of set the stage with two images, and this will be 1 and 2, and I'll come back to it. And I'll go back to these images as I speak. But the first that you find on the left-hand side is the spatial site of my inquiry, which is referred to in the archive as the northward. So this is the colonial documentation that refers to the northward, which is basically north of Bombay, and comprises the coasts of South Gujarat, the Gulf of Kathiawar, the Gulf of Kutch, moving up to Sindh and Makran. And this, of course, emerges in my period, 1780, 1820, as the classic epicenter of piracy from the closing decades of the 18th right until the 1820s. So this is the spatial site of my inquiry, and I concentrate really on the westernmost extremity of the Kathiawar Peninsula, that is the region that is called Okha Mandal, known for the temple at Dwarka, but really for me important because it works like a magnet that attracts dispossessed coastal groups to find shelter in the confederacy of small coastal states that emerge in this small tip of Okha Mandal with Dwarka as the temple, and a very unusual nexus that develops between the states, the small states, can't even call them states, and the temple at Dwarka, which also demands a percentage of the proceeds from piracy. So that's really what is the spatial site of my inquiry. Now, the same slide in red, you see, carries a snippet of documentation. There are many such snippets that are all in Gujarati Modi, which I got translated. And it refers to kinds of communication between Sundarji Khatri, who is a representative of the English East India Company stationed in Okha Mandal, who sent to confer with the various communities in Okha Mandal and the chiefs in Okha Mandal to try and think about how to eliminate the problem of attacks on coastal shipping. Now, if you look at and there are many such shards of documentation, all of them form part of the political compilations that the Bombay government put together called the item Pirates Northern. It's available in the Bombay archive. I've used some of it. It's actually quite extensive, but it is in snippets. So one has to read the fragment really carefully. And then, of course, I personally read it in tandem with the private papers of the English resident in Baroda, Colonel Alexander Walker, who features very strongly in my book, and whose personal papers I had access to thanks to the Edinburgh Library. And reading this in tandem gave me a much clearer sense of the context in which this was happening, the context in which raiding and predation activity occurred and what it meant. I'll have the next slide, please, and then maybe go back to a couple of others. Now, there are two slides that come in quick succession, which are the pirate depositions that I study. Again, they are very comprehensive. They run into, several pages. And these are really very interesting depositions. I'm not saying that these are unmediated or unfiltered. After all, they are depositions under duress. But if you read the depositions, you find fascinating accounts of lives and life stories. And I'm suggesting that with these kinds of life stories, I have some kind of means to be able to think about how pirates lived, how pirates thought of themselves, how piracy was an interlude in what was otherwise a normal mariner's life, and also the very complicated geography of piracy and the economy of piracy. If you, in fact, and we'll have occasion to look at these depositions in some detail, you realize that it's about agreements with certain rulers. It's about negotiations with rulers in the mainland. It's about selling material in grey markets, which is normally referred to as the Chor Bazaar in the documentation. And it's also about pirates being used for debt collection by merchants. So we are really talking about a variety of activities that is subsumed under piracy. And one of the best ways of looking at this was to look at these pirate depositions that I call unfulfilled promises, because you also find a situation when the pirates simply say that we're sick and tired of working for any of these states, and they sometimes simply flout all authority and then take to the seas themselves as individual rebels. And it's really a classic case of that limited moment of agency, which anyway is so difficult to capture in an archive. We all know, thanks to subaltern studies, thanks to the kind of work that we have on trying to document subaltern responses, that it's very difficult to get the, you really document it at the moment of failure. So you have agency and it's crushed, and that's when you have an entire archive that is generated. So in many ways, the limits of such an archive is something that I'm very well aware of. So Murari, I'll have the next slide, and I'll go back to a couple if I need to. I wanted to look at this particular slide because I feel that this particular deposition, I've really just extracted one page out of 50 pages, really talks about the way in which the pirates represent themselves. And you get a sense of community networks. You get a sense of how pirates rely on local Sufi peers to look after their family. You have a sense of how communities join hands, which are of different sort of ethnic denomination. You also have a very good sense of networks of information that pirates rely upon to decide on which ship to attack. So I want to therefore keep this in mind when I actually make some of my insights later on. So I want to then, having introduced a little bit the kind of archive that I was handling when I wrote the book, I want to sort of state the propositions that I made amidst the challenges of working with this kind of archive. and what kind of insights I felt I could draw and how they contested some of the existing assumptions on the subject. I'm not saying that there have not been other very important work on piracy that's happened, and I will have occasion to refer to this at some point. I'll have the next slide, and then we'll go back to it when I ask you to. Now, some of the assumptions are as follows. Now, we know that the European military aggression in the Indian Ocean was a fact. And we therefore had historians speak at length on the rise of Europe and their superior technology in subduing benign Asian waters. In other words, Asian seas was more or less sort of passive, and it's European military aggression in that enabled them to get mastery. Now, of course, this has been countered. We've got some very important work that talks about the use of maritime violence by Asian states, and the whole argument that Asian states were not just sitting quiet, and Asian states were in fact aware of the political use of violence at sea. Now, I'm not going into that entire debate, but I do want to say that there is that particular, particular assumption. You also have the evidence of very long-standing disputes. So I'm certainly not accepting the argument that the modern seas, the early modern seas, the Indian Ocean was empty of law, or was empty of negotiation, was empty of semi-legal deliberations. And I'm not therefore saying that there is unrestricted firepower, but nor am I saying that is entire, or there is a case of legal maneuvering, as Benton said, which I just talked about when I introduced it. I now feel that we do have a much greater consensus emerging, particularly in the context of work that's happening in Southeast Asia, that we need to go beyond all of this, and we need to start positioning and looking at piracy in a much more layered and complex political context. So this is, of course, in Southeast Asia, we had to deal, historians had to deal with the fetish of piracy studies that continue to look at pirates as rogues, enemies of mankind. And of course, this privileged a very narrow reading of European legal tracts over vernacular material that looked at raiding and maritime practices, where piracy is just one interlude in an otherwise normal seafaring life. Now, this is, of course, extremely evident when we look at the maritime world of Southeast Asia, whose experience I find really provides now, I've been reading this, provides us a very useful schema to look at regimes of predation, shadow economies, gray markets in a very unruly geography of sandy shoals and bays and harbors and swampy villages, very much like the villages that I work with Kathiawad and Gujarat, that form my spatial focus. So I've drawn, after writing the book, I've drawn subsequently, I've been thinking a lot about this from the work of Robert Anthony, who works on the Gulf of Tonkin, and who in fact has made a very interesting argument about how certain kinds of state building and geography proved conducive to certain forms of smuggling and raiding, and how pirates were able to use the geography to refit, recoup their ships. And there is a fascinating world and typology of pirates that are small-time raiders, indigenous groups, foreign pirates, pirate rebels, and pirate states. So this is a model that I find actually very useful in recent years. Now, admittedly, this came out recently. This was not a model that I was using when I did my work, because at that point, I was allowing the archive to tell the story, and also because I was very aware that unlike Chinese, Japanese, and Korean sources, we do not in India have a wide variety of vernacular, of semantic overtones to the category of the pirate. So if you think about Patricia Risso's work, you realize that we do not have too many, we don't have much nomenclature in terms of defining the pirate. So you fall back upon chor, daku, dasyu, but you really do not have the kind of, a range of words that embody the complex raiding practices that actually happen. So I was aware of that, and therefore I was prepared to look at my material and look at my context quite independently without thinking about any model that I was going to apply. What I did find when I approached the Western Littoral, the original site of my inquiry, that there were two things that were happening. There was, of course, an expansion of trade. There was an expansion of trade in cotton from Gujarat that was coming to Bengal and going to China. So there's a real acceleration of coastal trade. And there is, of course, a serious, there is serious incidents of attack on these coastal boats, which of course make the problem of piracy an official one. That's when you keep hearing about the complaints of fairly important merchants, Indian and Europeans, about piracy. That was one. But I also found in the same period a fascinating range of experiments in state building, which went alongside the new regulatory practices that the English East India Company was trying to impose on the coast, their attempt to police the coast, their attempt to introduce, or shall we say, extend the system of convoy, which is an old one, but attempt to extend it further. And in that context, I was actually struck by very numerous references, but very opaque, to pirates. And they were very generic terms. You had the term Malabar pirate, you had the term Northern pirate, you had the term Angriya, which is, of course, to do with the state of Colaba, the Angriya power of Colaba. You had the Malwans, but most persistently for my period, the coolies. They talked about the Koli rovers of Okhamandal, but it was very apparent that the Koli rovers were also working for states of Junagadh, Navanagar, Okhamandal, and subsequently Kutch, Sindh, and Makran. And then it would change and it would become pirates of Kutch and pirates of Makran and pirates of Sindh. So you had a series of references, which, of course, as I said, were generic. Now, most of these references to this generic piracy was, of course, by the Bombay Marine, which is the police force of the English East India Company. And that is, in fact, responsible for the first ethnographic survey of the coast and of the various coastal communities that inhabit the coast. Now, it's very easy to get lost in the marine records because the marine records are very rich. Very interesting ethnography, very technical, lots of nautical terms being used, a very good sense of the terrain, of the geography of the coast, but it also indicated the same repetition of pirates being rogues of mankind, etc., without or completely discounting several lapses of the regulatory regime. So one had to read the marine surveys alongside the petition of the merchants, of those who were caught, those small communities that were caught. And the petitions gave me a very, very different perspective on predation. The merchant petitions were insistent that the convoy was thoroughly inefficient and the convoy would not undertake its services responsibly. They would delay the going of the convoy. On many occasions, the convoy would encourage the merchants to go for private armed escort service. And as a result, you have a really messy situation. So even when the Marine is complaining about piracy, you have merchants saying that, look, the Marine commanding officer is saying, go ahead, take any armed escort and do what you like. So it was these kinds of gaps in the ethnography that forced me to think afresh about this archive that I was looking at. And it had a very different narrative that was coming through. Similarly, I had very interesting, representations from the chieftains and the communities that were caught. And these sort of communities, thank you, we'll go to the next slide. These communities now begin to speak about the need to look at what their bosses were doing. So you had a convergence of not merchants, but these groups that were engaged in raiding. They were engaged in debt collection. They were engaged in raiding and selling it to grey markets in a series of small littoral points, right from Porbandar, Nawabadar, Junagadh, Seer near Karachi and in Okhamandal. And you realize that by the late 1790s, Okhamandal, which is that extreme extremity in the westernmost part of the Kathiawar coast, becoming really an important center. Now, what you find from these petitions is two things. You find a series of small states that have emerged, the states of Bedwarka, Aramra, Positra, and chieftains of all these states who are normally of mixed Rajput origin. I say mixed, they call themselves Wagher Rajputs, but they are mixed because they are not allowed entry into the temple at Dwarka because they are seen as kind of slightly polluting castes. And these chieftains are in very close contact with the seafaring Vadalas, who could be both Hindu and Muslim with shared practices. And these states that form the Okha Mandal Confederacy become really important in sponsoring a series of piratical raids on Bombay shipping and engaging in a discourse that looks at both disruptive past politics of the company, of the Bombay Marine, that talks about the need to survive in a very difficult situation of economic distress, and also talks about the kind of customary sanction that they had in undertaking the activity. So you actually find a typology of pirates that emerge in Okha Mandal, a typology that, of course, is very well identified by Alexander Walker, the company resident in Baroda, who is responsible for eradicating this problem, and who's probably the more sensitive resident who is trying to make a distinction between all kinds of people who are lumped together as pirates. And he's in fact saying that we need to make a distinction between pirate communities, pirate states, and we also need to get rid of this obsession about getting compensation, because the minute you keep asking for restitution, you are pushing them into piracy again. So Walker made a very simple point. He said, unless you can eradicate it by violence, which you're not prepared to do because it's expensive, you might as well go in for negotiation and try and understand the pirate subject. So that makes Walker a really interesting and a dissonant voice in the archive, which is what drew me to his personal papers, drew me to the way in which Walker constantly fights with his colleagues in Bombay. So the correspondence that you have in Bombay is a series of angry deliberations and controversies between Walker and the Bombay government. And if you look at the personal papers of Walker, there's a very different sort of resident that emerges from these papers. So I found it very useful to look at this in tandem, to be able to disentangle the very complex negotiations about piracy. Now, I'm saying, therefore, that given the inherent mobility of the pirate, who kept moving, because what you find in personal papers of Walker is very interesting. He says that, look, for the last 30 years, we've been looking at pirates moving from one state to the other. Whenever you attack Bhavnagar, they've moved to Navanagar. When you attack Navanagar, they've moved to Junagadh. You attack Junagadh and ask them to contain piracy, they move elsewhere. So here we have a document of a moving littoral subject. And therefore, it is actually very difficult to overlook this aspect of past politics of the company and the reactions to this politics, which is dispossession and an attempt to look at some kind of livelihood strategy. So I find that while the early phase of pirate ethnography talked about irrationality, superstition, depravity, enemies of mankind, by the time you come to Walker, you have a much more measured view of the problem of piracy. He questions the idea of piracy as an expression of a failed state. He does not even say it's entirely a cultural formation and that piracy is done by these superstitious, irrational subjects. He's in fact tries to position it within a framework of littoral politics and tries to assess the consequences of overall political instability in the period, some of which is the direct consequence of the entry of the English company and its past politics. So what you find in his papers is a constant invocation of custom. He says it's useless to talk law or legality. It's even useless to talk about treaty obligations. They don't know. So why not look at the customary guarantee for good behavior, what he calls the sharist, the mulk sharista, the law of the land, the custom of the land, and try and get some kind of an understanding of what's happening in this entire space. So he's in fact saying that they are a mobile group. Unless you are able to use force, unless you're able to really understand the connections that these groups have, communities have with villages, markets, debt collectors, merchants, and states, you're not going to be able to bring an end to this piracy. And therefore, let us try a completely different option. Now, there are treaties that are signed. They're pretty useless. None of them really work. And you have constant, it's almost endemic, the attacks by these men, mostly on coastal shipping. But by 1812, we will have a shift in this particular phenomenon. I also want to make the point that Walker was the first to also raise the issue of, and I'm saying this because later ethnography keeps talking about Dwarka, Okha Mandal, and the Okha rebels as some kind of religious sanctioned piracy. This is a trope that you find in all the romantic British colonial ethnographers, beginning from Colonel Todd and ending right up to, Kincaid in the 20th century. So I do want to talk a little bit about how Walker is talking about Okha Mandal and Dwarka. And he makes a very interesting point. He says that, look, we find that the pirates constantly talk about their activity as the gift of Krishna, the Lord of Dwarka, who is a beloved god known for his dalliances and theft. And the pirates argue, therefore, that this is something which is our livelihood, and it has the kind of customary sanction of religion. Now, however, I don't want to push this argument to Walker, because I think what Walker was trying to do, and he has these deliberations through Sundarji with the pirates, was that they were trying to make the point that in this complex and ambiguous agreements about the proceeds of piracy, the temple trustees of Dwarka had a dominant share. So I feel that we need to look at these statements, we need to look at these archival references with much greater attention, rather than, because there's a tendency for us to think piracy is the gift of Krishna. You draw a straight line with Todd, and then with Kincaid, and then with the Bahir Jatiyas of Kathiawad, and there's a kind of romanticization of the outlaw. I just want to be cautious, and I want to say that there are, in the depositions that we have before Walker, before McMurdo, later on, pirates are constantly invoking not a language of rights, not a language of law, but a mythology of custom, and most importantly, a network of information. What you get from the deposition is neither law so much, nor even religion, but a network of social contacts that could have an element of shared religious practice. For example, you have several depositions that talk about the importance of peers who look after families, peers who tell them that, look, stay quiet for some time, lay low, lie low. We will give you information about what's happening in Bombay in a couple of months. So you have this shared network of information, which I think is very, very important, which really is not about sovereign rights on the ocean. It's not even about a conception of limited offshore waters, territorial waters, as it is of this ambiguous practices that happen, and that I think a new book or a new essay by Jennifer Gaynor encapsulates very well, and I'll come to that in the very end. She uses the category of the offing. The offing is a nautical term, and I'll come back to it. And she feels it really encompasses the complexity of looking from the shore to the sea and the sea to the shore, and how you can only see a little bit and you can't see the whole thing, and how we can use that productively. So I feel that this is kind of important to think about. I'll have the next slide. Now, by the time we have, how am I doing for time, Murari? Can I have about 5 to 10 minutes? Okay. So by the time we come to the first quarter, or the first decade of the 19th century, you find that Okamandal has sort of oriented its politics to Kutch. And I refer to this expanding geography of piracy because what you find is a massive influx of pirates from Dwarka, from the entire coast of Kathiawad, into the Gulf of Kutch, into Sindh, particularly into Seer and Jakhau between 1811 and 1813. Here again, I find that the responsibility of the commanding officer, James McMurdo, to collect information on pirate haunts and the secrets of the pirates, again, fabulous, rich information that gives you a sense of a really moving geography, which is very difficult to kind of anchor. Now, what I find with 1811, 1812, and McMurdo is now on an all-out strike against the politics of Kutch, against the state of Kutch, you find that there is substantial information on pirates who turn approvers and a set of pirate depositions that McMurdo collects and produces before the Bombay government. And I found I've used the confessions fairly substantially in my book. And the confessions are very, very interesting. The confessions point to two things. They talk about the absolute determination of the states of Kutch and the Amirs of Sindh. So they are moving further into the northwest. It'd be very interesting to see what happens with piracy in the Trucial coast subsequently. You find that all of them use the Okamandal pirates to carry on their politics. But in the depositions, what you find is a real sense of frustration that the pirates take the blame and the states take the plunder. And this is something which really is a repetitive trope in the depositions. And more interesting is how the pirate, in his life experiences that I've talked about at length in my book, actually talks about very often his ease or the ability with which he's able to get the information on what is moving from Bombay Harbor, going where, or what is leaving Surat, what is leaving Bharuch, and what can be attacked, and how quickly he is able to assemble a motley crew of fairly trained mariners to go out on piracy. So very often you have them working for states, but very often you also have working for merchants and selling them in grey markets. Very often you have also a sheer expression of autonomous resistance against all. So there is a real sense of outrage against the company, the passes of the Bombay Marine, the Amirs of Sindh, the rulers of Kutch, and the decision to go straight out, to just sort of rebel. So it gives you really a sense of this, of the salty subaltern's outrage against what is happening. And I found those very useful to sort of think about and maybe engage through that with Redeker's views on radicalism. I'll have the last slide, please. So I want to therefore, wind all this up and draw my threads of the argument about both the archive and about how I read them into thinking perhaps collectively and sharing this with colleagues in other parts of the Indian Ocean world and think about certain categories that we can use for understanding piracy. Can we look at agency more carefully, more critically? Because it's evident that it is not just theft, it's not even just raiding, it requires extraordinary skill. Because it's very interesting that the Bombay Marine is unable to exterminate the pirates because their vessels are too large. Their technology is not micro enough to be able to deal with littoral waters. So it's a very different kind of skill, very different kind of organization, very different kind of networks. And I'm suggesting that even colonial sources capture this. I'm also fascinated by the idea of veoffing, which is this nautical term that privileges neither land nor sea, and it captures a certain ambiguity about the phenomena. And I think it really helps us understand piracy more abstractly. And I'm really thinking a little bit about how one could use it, how one could understand how piracy plays out in relation to all kinds of power relations that seem to exist in land somehow get porous when you leave the territorial waters, and plays out very differently in littoral villages over which even coastal chiefs do not have authority. I'm also looking at mobility and dispossession, which is why I feel that we need to look at labor mobility. I also have to remember that many of the captured pirates constitute the crew for the Bombay Marine in the later 19th century. I also want to think differently, perhaps, about littoral imaginations. How do we understand littorals in an empirical way, right along unruly geographies, whether they are of the Gulf of Tonkin or the Gulf of Kutch, and perhaps come to not a shared understanding, but at least perhaps try and think about a more connected history of predation and piracy in the late 18th, mid 19th century. So I'll stop there. Thank you. I hope I was audible because I didn't really check my connection.
No, I think it was perfectly all right. It was
okay, great. Yeah, I'm glad.
Yeah. So thank you so much. It was really very interesting to hear some of the new things that you're planning in terms of a comparative study with Southeast Asia, and also kind of expanding it temporarily, bringing it to almost mid-19th century. Yeah, so I think this two concepts, privateering, which had kind of legal sanction in Europe. You talked about, William Kidd, and in Dutch, they have almost kind of have many folklores around this individual called Pieters June Hein, who is renowned for attacking Spanish silver ship coming from the Americas and kind of enriching the state, and then kind of diminutive term as predators and kind of marauders or whatever implied for those involved in piracy. And yeah, as you said, we don't have that much information coming on them. We know we categorize them Cho, Daku, Dasyu, and all kind of things. But wonder whether there are some similar Robin Hood-like figures coming from such pirates who is known for philanthropy, aiding a particular smaller state in terms of augmenting the resources of that small but fledgling aspirational state in the what you call, of course, strategically difficult geography where such forces actually flourish and thrive. And so I have, along with this, I have a couple of other queries, and then I'll open it to the audience. So would it be right to assume that the pirates or piracy in this region, Okha Mandal, did they emerge and operate because of the local contingency? Of course, that local contingency dictated them because land was not that fertile, so they needed to augment resources, and maritime entrepreneurship in their own ways could be the one. But one wonders, whether there was some broader political goal in terms of forging alliances with similar other groups dispersed along that long stretch up to Makran and Sindh and that area. And because I think, this, again, this is going to be so fascinating in terms of, because this is the same region where Mughals could never had an effective control. And they even kind of requested towards the late 17th century, Aurangzeb asked the European company, particularly the Dutch, to protect the convoys, and eventually even Dutch failed, and that resulted in blockage of Surat and all that. So it was not easy actually to effectively patrol and control this. So whether they were, now my last question, whether these so-called pirates, whether they had a sense and and as you said, customary law or customary kind of practice. So they try to systematize it in terms of collecting some rahdari kind of thing, as other landed chiefs would do in difficult parts of the empire, or they were kind of taking everything, whatever came to their hands. So I think I'll stop here, perhaps. I think, and yeah.
Should I respond? I'll respond quickly and then maybe take other questions. Thank you very much. I mean, they're very useful questions, Murari. Let me start with the philanthropy question. Do we have any instances of, groups that support the organization of pirate states? Very difficult to answer this because, as I said, the kind of fragmentary information that you have, I can't do more than venture. I don't think they were particularly, I wouldn't use the word philanthropy. I would say that there is a fairly coherent understanding between the states, the smaller states that I don't want to call pirate states. I mean, that's Walker's categorization, but small states. Even Junagadh, for instance, the Nawab of Junagadh is very invested in supporting and sponsoring certain raids because that's part of his resource generation. You have a very detailed ethnography of what the Nawab of Junagadh is actually doing, or for some time the ruler of Bhavnagar did. He then, of course, becomes approver and becomes an ally of the company. So I think that there is a coherent strategy and agreement between men who are part of the crew and who do the actual raiding, and states and, shall we say, bosses, local bosses, who sponsor them, who will say that we are not responsible because these are unmanageable. They will say that to the company official or Sundarji, as one of the depositions say, that you are the strong man, go and try and convince him. I can't do it. But that's really just a fait accompli. I do think that over 20 years in Okhamandal, there is a coherent set of arrangements that is emerging between dispossessed groups who are seafarers, sea raiders, and who are in agreement with these local bosses. I wouldn't even venture to call them states in Okhamandal, but certainly in South Gujarat, yes. In Junagadh, can be, yes. And I think, therefore, there is a clear sense that maritime resource is an important resource. Maritime violence is an important resource for state building. And in many ways, it puts them into direct confrontation with the English East India Company. So the answer is yes to that first question, but partly because I'm constrained by what I actually have. I think it's a very interesting point. The third question, I'll come back to I'll come back to the second and third question, which is about a sense of customary sanction, and do we have a clear system of, or do we have a tendency to systematize capture, right? I mean, I think that's the way I'd put it. I would actually say that there is a very clear, there is an interest in acquiring certain commodities that have good markets. So the pirates are not just attacking random. So there is information that, hey, look, wait for this. There is a ship going out with lots of sugar, and this is going to fetch a good market. And this way you can actually pay off the debt obligations of that merchant. Or sometimes they attack small ships of the company itself, which they can then capture and rejig to make it amenable for, it's like, it's a capital investment, right? You attack a ship and then you refurbish it and then you use it for your raid. So I think it's not at all random. There is a particular way of systematizing raids. The problem, of course, with the maritime, and this is ocean as method perhaps, or water as method, the problem is that you do not have the kind of systematic material that is generated on revenues. You know, this is such a, it is such a mobile and such a fluid one that it would be difficult for me to tell you absolutely exactly that there is systematization. All that I would therefore say is that there is certainly a pattern that emerges about what needs to be ransacked, what needs to be raided. And that is not made only out of impulse. There are sometimes when I find there are some expeditions that seem to be just a matter of impulse and even a use of gratuitous violence. But then there are also those depositions that say that, look, there is that, Mulu Mapla who has told us in Bombay that this is about to sail, so let us wait. And you have a bizarre assemblage of ethnic generic terms, which I not take very seriously because, mind you, they're all mediated through company documentation. I do not believe that the company had a very good sense of what they were talking about anyway. So it may not be A. Mapla. On the other hand, there's Musa Mapla, who's constantly figuring in my depositions in Calcutta. Now, we don't know what his sphere of operations was. You have Badalas, you have a number of references to castes that subsequently are referred to as criminal caste. So I'm very cautious about using the terms that the company archive is generating. I therefore have to tread very, very carefully. To the second point, and I think that's important and something I can't really answer, but I feel with extending the temporality of my study into at least till the 1830s and 40s, I will actually have a richer story to tell. Interestingly, there is much more material in the archive and in the Bombay archive. I don't know about the British archives, but I know there is in the Bombay archive. I've seen it. I have it. I haven't read it. Much of the material that you find on piracy in the 30s and 40s are all in Arabic. The depositions that I have in the political consultations, which are Gujarati Modi and some in English, which have been translated by McMurdo, that goes. When you look at the 30s and the 40s, the bulk of the depositions of the pirates is in Arabic. And somebody needs to therefore explore that and perhaps have a richer story to tell. So I do really believe, I don't know whether I can do it anymore. I mean, I've sort of worked on this for a long time. I'm probably more, personally, I would love to see somebody do it. Personally, I am interested in looking at a more connected conversation that happens in approaches to studying this. I think right now, having done a fair amount of empirical archival work, I think I'd like to think more conceptually about how do we bring areas in the Indian Ocean into conversation. For example, we don't even talk about piracy in the Bay of Bengal, the same period, and the piracy in Gujarat, and as though they are like completely different stories. I mean, they may be, but I think it is time now for us to have a more connected conversation. So I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor. I see Dilip and Tejaswini's hands. So whoever, maybe Dilip, if you like to go ahead.
Teju had a hand up before me, so maybe she should go.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I didn't see it. Okay.
Thanks, Dilip. I just want to thank Lakshmi for a really rich and generative conversation. And I know this will carry through into the rest of the series as well. And I hope that you will attend and
I will.
bringing up these questions. Yeah. I have really a whole bunch of questions, but I'll confine myself to some short ones. I was really puzzled in an interesting sort of way, I guess, by the constant complaints of the pirates in their depositions. That how they kept saying that they were left with nothing, they were left with nothing, everything was taken away. So my question was, why did they continue then doing this work? So was it a ritual complaint? And what was then the significance of that? If you could comment on that, that would be lovely. Then two small questions. You did mention somewhere that, or one of the testimonies said that someone had been in the work for 5 generations.
Yeah.
So I want to know a little more, although you did answer this partially. Who were the pirates? You said later they were classified as criminal tribes. Was it a range of people who were, engaging in the piracy? Did they come and go into that occupation, into and from the occupation? So who exactly would they be? And could you shed some more light on their religious affiliation as well? And a last one, again, you partially answered this. You talked about complex practices of raiding that the pirates engaged in. And I simply assumed that it meant that they did different kinds of things and some were called raids or all were called raids. But you seem to suggest that it's more about identifying the kind of ship to raid, the kind of cargo it was carrying, who it belonged to, etc. So did I get this wrong, or is there something else you want to get at when you talk about the complex practices of raiding? Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Teju. Great questions as usual. I'll start with the first one, the third one, the last one first. They are complex practices of raiding because these men are inhabitants of coastal villages, littoral villages, which are marshy, swampy, very useful to hide boats, in the long, tall grass and so on and so forth. But interestingly, they are engaged in both a bunch of different things. For instance, the first major company offensive against pirates happens when there is an instance of cattle raiding and horse raiding that is reported. Now, this is obviously not done at sea. This is done in the village, or this is done along the littoral, as it were. So, on the other hand, this is just the tip of the iceberg. When I mean complex practices of raiding, I am saying that there are small-time raiders who could attack cotton boats, small cotton boats laden with 3 bales of cotton, 2 canisters of sugar. There can be slightly larger raids when you have 2 or 3 pirates' boats, coming towards a larger fleet and attacking. You could also have pirates working for very specific merchants to have their debt obligations. So I'm suggesting that, and there are those raids that are sponsored by the Confederacy of Chiefs, the local bosses of Okamandi. So to me, all of them are clubbed together as pirates. The interesting thing is some of them have actually the tacit sanction of the local bosses. Some of them are completely spasmodic, sporadic, episodic, and can't even be, put into a box for me to analyze. Some of them are definitely things that have carried on for 5 to 7 years. So I would assume that I would read that these are also done by a motley of communities that seem to find some kind of common identification. It doesn't mean that they belong to the same community. You have specific communities mentioned. You have the Kolis mentioned, the Coolies mentioned. You have the Vadalas mentioned, the most important seafaring community of Gujarat mentioned as pirates. Then you have certain Wagher pirates mentioned who seem to be both Hindu and Muslim. They've shared practices. So it's difficult for me to tease out the ethnic, religious denomination of these guys. But they all seem to have been experts at steersmanship. They have excellent navigational skills, which is something that the marine officials constantly talk about and say, these could be very important recruits for our own marine force. So there is obviously a sense of the coastal peoples who are fishermen, boatmen, steersmen, navigators, and also pirates. So that's the kind of loose, amorphous band that I seem to have. That brings me, in a sense, to the second question, which is we are pirates of 5 generations or 7 generations. I think this is a rhetorical invocation. I wouldn't be able to say, and it's something which we all do, like 7 generations we've done this. But I do know for a fact that there are some instances where the grandfather of a pirate in question was actually the private navigator of an English private merchant, the personal navigator of a private merchant. So one can assume that the arrival of Europeans doing coastal trade below the radar, not officially, would have made use of local navigators, would have made use of local steersmen. And these men who know the coast really well, the back of the hand, could very quickly turn to raiding when they needed to. Because very often you find even earlier, if you look at the Malabar coast and if you look at the rovers of the Angria, you find very often that this is a part-time occupation. It's an occupation when you don't have anything to do. The agricultural season is over. You sort of, it's like mixed agriculture. Instead of rearing cattle and growing crop, you grow crop and you raid. So it's that kind of an economy that I think that we are thinking about. So I think I would not take the invocation of 5 generations too seriously, except to say that in my own understanding of the archive that I've assembled, there are some figures who have really persisted for 20 years and they just go on and on. I can't give you their ages. It would require a different kind of detective work, but there are some families that persist and they may well be. I don't want to immediately say they were, because that will put me into the trap of pathologizing them as criminals, which I don't want to do. But they seem to be very, and part of that community, the Kaso community, for example, Nakwa Kaso, Jesa Kaso, many of them turn approvers, but the depositions don't say very much more about, except this ritual invocation that we've always known the sea and we've always been pirates. So, also who knows whether it is under duress. So that's the problem of reading this sort of depositions. The first question was good, very important, I think, and I don't think I did justice to it. Yeah, the pirates are constantly complaining, particularly the Kutchi pirates, that the depositions that I talk about are the Kutchi pirates, where I think there is a real division of authority between bosses in Kutch. So you have somebody in Mandvi, which is a port town, and somebody in Bhuj, which is the littoral. And a lot of the complaints of the pirates are also about the fractured politics that is taking place in Kutch. And I think that this is also an attempt by the pirates to leverage their connections with the two competing parties. So I think that we need to read this not just as a ritual complaint, which it could have been, but I think also the ways in which the pirates are also trying to jockey between two competing sources of power in Kutch itself. Having said that, I must also say that there are instances, most of the instances of the pirate depositions talk about them being left with very low margins. But there are also instances when the pirates say that, look, enough is enough. We're just not going to listen to anybody and we're going to pirate. And we know that there's a market that's going to absorb the goods. So I think that there is an element of rationality in this kind of low level, shall I say, economic activity. And also, I think it is a sign of leveraging for political influence within the fractured politics of Kutch. So that would be my response to your question. Just give me 1 minute, Dilip. I'm going to put on the lights in my room. Just 1 minute.
Okay, right.
Yeah. Yeah, carry on.
Actually, just to take up where you left off, I'm sorry I couldn't attend the first 10 minutes. I was doing my own talk, and being a narcissist, I persisted in doing that before I came to yours.
Wise of you, yeah.
No, so with regard to this observation about the pirates constantly complaining, I mean, I think it's fairly natural. I don't think it requires an explanation. I mean, it's very rare that a chor would say, "Madam, bahut munafa hai is peshe mein." Right? It's very unlikely. So, in that sense, this sense of constant complaint is also goes to the fact that you don't want to display your wealth in the region. Multiple things which are to do with social performance and so on and so forth. But that's just a comment. The three specific questions that I had for you is that I was just thinking alongside Jatin Dua's work, on the Somalian pirates, right?
Yeah.
And to think these two cases together, where what Jatin Dua says about the Somalian pirates is that these guys, they enter into the piracy, they make a bit of money, and the money is like a primitive accumulation which allows them to marry, have kids, chew cut, and sit around with the other uncles on the shore, chatting, gossiping, and so on. So there's this constant transition in their lives that is happening. So in the instances that you showed, there's one example where somebody says, I lived as a pirate for one season.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's one of the things.
Yeah.
And then there's also the others who say we are Pushtani pirates. We've been 7 generations, 6 generations, and so on. So when we look at these two kinds of things, to relate it to the question that you raised about the parsimony of language, with regard to that, there aren't many terms available for pirates. If you think about the fact that piracy is an occasional occupation for many, that they might go to sea and engage with this for one season, in times of trouble. So they don't gel into a caste-like formation, perhaps, which would then give us a proliferation of terms.
Yeah, right.
Also, if you think about, they don't form a kind of terrible scare for the East India Company, as in the case of the thugs, where the thuggy become a distinct category. So that's a set of comments around that. The second one was, one of the interesting things about Jatin's book is that one of the things that he shows is that the persistence of the Somalian pirates, right? I mean, the fact that this phenomenon continued despite the presence of the 7th Fleet, right? The American 7th Fleet is just there. What are they hanging around for? So what he shows is how Lloyd's insurance company is very tied in with this, because obviously more piracy, more premium. And so Lloyd's is also involved in this larger, and as you know, Jatin worked for a period with Lloyd's as well as hanging around with the pirates, right? So both of these at the same time. So the question here arising from that is, when we think about what were the forms, were there forms of local insurance available for merchants?
Yeah.
Right? So did merchants want to protect their goods? Did they have arrangements of that kind, which also relates to this question of information networks, right? I mean, you talked about peers providing information and so on. So alongside these information networks, how do information networks, questions of insurance, all of this work together? That's the second question. And the final question is a very broad question, because I've looked at the Walker-Bolan papers myself. I've used it for Malabar. Before he went to Gujarat, he began his career in northern Kerala, right?
Yeah.
And it's interesting here that very few people actually engage with the fact that Walker is very influenced by the Scottish Enlightenment.
Yes.
This is very evident in his writings. Right? So that might explain to a large extent the way he relates to piracy and other forms of what are customary activities. Because one of the things that he does in Kerala is the comparative method, that nothing is unique here. We have this in other parts of the world, and so on and so forth. So coming from a space where piracy was very common, you mentioned William Kidd, the Piracy Act is passed as late as 1717, right? But so piracy is almost over in Scotland by the time he comes here. So how do we think about the influence of the Scottish Enlightenment and the fact that there's a particular person with a particular intellectual lineage who's also an intellectual, right? I mean, he's not just somebody, because he's putting down female infanticide, he's engaging with questions of sati, and piracy is one among the many things that he engaged with. So that was the question.
Very well. Again, great questions, Dilip. I don't know whether I can do justice to all of them, but let me start with insurance. I think that's a very important question. I want to say that it's not always that archives on insurance will intersect with archives on piracy. And I'll tell you why. The stuff that you get as far as local insurance is concerned is mostly to do with the mayor court, which is busy thinking about systematizing insurance practices and protocols to help Indian and European merchants deal with piracy. Because at the end of the day, the brunt of these attacks is faced by cotton merchants, both Parsi, Gujaratis, and Europeans. And they're all going to the mayor's court and saying that, look, this is getting really difficult and we need to think about insurance protocols, because many of the insurance agents who are all Gujarati Banyas don't want to give who don't want to pay up for the risk. So it's not as though insurance doesn't exist or that we don't have material on insurance. You have a lot of material on insurance, which is quibbling constantly about who is the pirate that we can insure you against. Is Hyder Ali a pirate? Is Manik Mullu a pirate? So there is another category of the pirate that is generated by an insurance archive. But that doesn't necessarily speak to my protagonists, partly because, not because it's in a physical remove, but because I think the kind of piracy and the politics that I have been focusing on is the small state pirate. And where the profit margins, of course, for the pirate may be okay, moderate to high, but we are really not talking about massive raids on several junks, as you have in the Chinese case. You're talking about continuous harassment of small coastal boats that are carrying limited amounts of goods across the littoral. And that is what is so annoying as far as the company is concerned, because they want to rationalize everything. They find this kind of small scale activity itself irrational. So I think it's a very, very important point, and I can't tell you what kinds of insurances we have. I feel that piracy itself acts as an insurance as far as local merchant bosses are concerned. So I'm reading it a little differently, but I think it's extremely important. I really like the point about the parsimony of language. You're absolutely correct. Given the fact that these are myriad actors, these are actors who are engaged in a variety of occupations, who are essentially mobile. That's my whole argument, that they are a mobile lot, and therefore they cannot be anchored within either a caste conglomerate or within a territorial space for a caste conglomerate. It is very difficult for me to get that, that parsimony of language idea that I think you really put it across extremely well. I think that is extremely important, and therefore we need to think a little bit more carefully about how do we categorize it. Do I go in for a community explanation, which doesn't quite work? Do I go in for an occupational category, which is really what I prefer? I prefer to think of pirates as occupational seamen who have the ability to actually do this quite well. And then in which case we can think a little bit more about how a community can cohere around occupation and networks of practice and information. So you could have a network of men who may or may not belong to a shared religious practice. They seem to be very mixed. I don't seem to get a very clear sense of what they are, but I don't think you can with coastal communities anyway. I think there's a lot more fluidity in these categories. And I think that would be very interesting for us to think about what kind of language can we actually adopt in categorizing the pirate, rather than me arguing that we do not have a language. Can we use whatever we have and turn it on its head and see what kind of language we can generate? So thank you very much. I think that's a very, very important set of questions. The third section, which is, of course, on Walker. Walker is an interesting guy. He is completely a member of the Scottish Enlightenment. He's informed by the same kind of the notions of moral and social community values, which is really where the Scottish Enlightenment is actually talking about, unlike, and which also, we know that it impacts so much of the political economy argument, even of Adam Smith. So we're talking about the Scottish Enlightenment that thinks about social justice, social community, and Walker is very much part of that. I think it's also important that Walker is also really interested in history, and I'll tell you why. He's not only talking about infanticide, sati, pirates, Malabar, which he's in Malabar long before he comes to Gujarat. He's also interested in things like epistolary conventions. How do people write letters in India? So how do pirates rule their depositions in India? So he's really like an intellectual. And I've got a fascinating file that talks about epistolary conventions in India, and he's giving you samples of how this guy writes and how that guy writes, and how do we make sense of that? So in many ways, I think that a lot of his intellectual engagement is invested in looking at pirates very carefully, which is why he is constantly making a distinction between pirate states and pirate communities. And he says that we've got to make a distinction between them. Pirate states have to be more responsible, and you have to talk about law to them. Don't talk about law to pirate communities who are anyway on a very flimsy wicket. All your calculations tell me that they've got very little. They've probably made about $1,000 over 3 years. So what are you complaining about? Now, this the company establishment takes great exception to. So what for me was interesting was how an intellectual commitment, a real historian's understanding of local phenomena is at odds with the bureaucratic rationale of the company government in Bombay. And that is what is producing for me a fragmented archive, which I say is very rich. So I'm not making the argument that it's not yielding. I'm actually saying it's actually very rich.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have a couple of questions here in the chat box. One relates to, whether we can, how can we distinguish pirates from competing Indian merchants of the time in European sources, considering that Europeans also labeled Indian merchants who refused to compromise as pirates? Okay, that's perhaps from a student. And there are...
There are two more.
Okay,
so maybe I'll answer this quickly. I think that's a great question, Aswin. I do distinguish them because I think Indian merchants, depends on the merchants. You have fairly substantial Indian merchants in European sources who are competing with Europeans, both with the Portuguese and with the Dutch and the English, as far as trade in the West Asian markets are concerned. Now, barring the Portuguese who designate Arab and Gujarati merchants engaged in spice as pirates, I don't think the European East India companies, despite their hubris, would call Indian merchants like Chalabi and Gafoor as pirates. I think what is interesting is that there are Indian merchants who do not compromise as far as the European convoy system is concerned. And there are Indian merchants who used, as I said, armed escorts to defy the convoy and carry on. And they would then have the disadvantage of being treated as such in a case. It never comes up to a court case. In the depositions, you find, therefore, that there are a lot of gradations about the way you want to look at merchant competitors, the way you want to look at pirates who are raiding. I mean, I think there is a difference between merchants who are competing in markets and men who actually attack your property in the coast, off the shore, and sort of do not want to justify their actions in a particular rhetoric. So I think there are very clear distinctions between merchants and pirates. There's one other question, which I may read by Mridula Mane, which is whether I find reflections on architecture and construction practices very interesting. I really don't know. I would simply say that, in Okha Mandal, you have these, and I think in parts of Kutch, but certainly in Okha Mandal, you have these warrior stones. The warrior stones always celebrate great piratical chiefs. And there is a lore, there is a kind, pirates and outlaws become part of the local mythology of Okha Mandal. And if you look at hero stones, they're called these hero stones, which are quite common in Gujarat and Kathiawad, which are also part of the Rajput Bardic tradition. So what I found interesting in looking at the hero stones that, interestingly, European ethnographers like Hornell talk about in the 20th century, is the strange braiding of warrior lineage Rajput politics with seafaring communities. And there's a strange way in which Gujarat's history, which becomes much more landed, local, Rajput, Hindu, had a very complex, shared Hindu-Muslim past. And that is evident in some of those hero stones. So I can only talk a little bit about the hero stones. I've written about it in the book, in the epilogue. I look at these hero stones, but I can't say whether there are clear construction practices on the coast. It would be interesting because pirates often talk about the intrusion of lighthouses, while the Bombay Marine uses the lighthouse and then, engages in local, very micro level aggression on pirates by throwing stones. Some of them hit the temple at Dwarka, creates a huge ruckus in 1800. So I have those kinds of, tidbits of information, but I'm afraid I won't be really able to give you much on on architecture and construction practices. I think one interesting construction history that we should be doing is the boats. I'd be very interested in looking at the rejigged and the refitted pirate boats that I really have not done. That will sort of force me into a different kind of work, but I think it's work that needs to be done.
I think there's one more by Dipesh Kamkar.
Okay, let me just read it. Yeah. Raw maps of coastal areas and their pothis, any similar sketching of routes. Fascinating question. I haven't seen a map, but if I were to sit with all my depositions, which will take me about at least 3 months, I could actually sketch routes. Because they give you routes. They tell you where they are going first, how they are slipping somebody, how they are taking shelter in some coastal villages, how somebody smuggles some food to them. And so I think I could actually, somebody, a student of mine who could do an MA project perhaps on just sketching the routes that pirates undertook. So yeah, that's a very interesting question that you asked, but I can't immediately tell you. But yes, you do have clear information of routes taken by these guys as they embark on certain campaigns, provided, of course, they are caught, captured, and made to depose. So a lot of it depends on how quickly they are caught and made to depose. It's the depositions that give me the information.
Okay.
Okay.
Great.
Yeah.
I think this is okay. I think there's one more message and okay, yeah. Once
Okay, so
again, this has
sorry.
been fascinating. This has been fascinating. Murari, I think you have one question, and we could then wrap it up because it is time.
No, do we have one question?
If there is one last question, we could go for it. Otherwise,
and just a quick comment for Lakshmi. I mean, you were speaking about boats. Alexander Walker has lots of sketches of boats in his papers.
Okay, I haven't seen that actually. I haven't seen that, Dilip. I will. I mean, if I can. Okay, great. I don't think there are questions. I looked at the messages, but
No, so
anyway, I leave it to you.
I think now it's perhaps the time. So I'd like to thank the speaker, Professor Lakshmi Subramanian, for the great talk and taking all the questions from the audience. I also like to thank Center for Inter-Asian Research and Center for Indian Studies in Africa, Professor Tejaswini Niranjana and Professor Dilip Menon for facilitating and allowing us actually to continue with the second iteration of this webinar series. Well, I would like to thank all the participants for coming and being here. So, Savan, do you want to add something?
Just a quick announcement. Our next speaker is going to be Professor Ismail Fajri Alatas from NYU, and we are looking forward to his talk, which will be something around the transoceanic geographies between, say, Indonesia and Saudi Arabia. He's actually asking us to rethink the very center-periphery dichotomy that has been built. So, but this was
Fascinating.
lovely, Lakshmi. Just wonderful listening to you. The kinds of ideas that we are just running and raising our minds with. It's just lovely. I hope all the other participants will also be there for our next session and various other talks that we have scheduled, which we will slowly unravel. But there is also this bit of mystery that we are trying to play along with. So thank you, Lakshmi. Thanks to all our participants for the day. Thank you, Dilip. Thank you, Murari. Thank you, Tejaswini. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Lakshmi again. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you very much. This was very enjoyable, and just I'm in the mailing list, so I'm sure I'll get all the information. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.